Hello, this is Rabbi David Abramson. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Vayikra, the first portion in the book of Leviticus. But this Shabbat also is a week or so before Pesach. A week from Saturday night will be the first night of Pesach. And so I thought it would be a nice idea to do some Pesach learning this week. What I'd like to do is to explore two familiar Pesach symbols and see what rabbinic literature has to teach us about these symbols. As I said, they are familiar to us. What I'd like to explore are the traditions of drinking 4 cups of wine at the Seder and the tradition of eating charoset at the Seder. I'll tell you in advance that some of our sources are Tanaitic sources. The Mishnah and the Tosefta, the primary Tanaitic sources, were compiled in the 3rd century. We'll also be taking a look at some Talmudic sources, and the Talmud was compiled in the 6th century. That's all I'll say about the history of these two sources, at least for now. Our first source from the Mishnah deals with the question of drinking 4 cups of wine at the Seder. Arvei Pesachim Samuch LaMincha, on the day before Pesach, from about the time of the Mincha, afternoon sacrifice, Lo yochal adam ad shetechshach. A man should not eat until nightfall. There may be a practical reason for this tradition of fasting for a few hours before the Seder begins. For one thing, people are so busy preparing for the Seder. But in addition, because we'll be eating so much at the Seder, and because we'll be eating so many important ritual foods at the Seder, it seems appropriate to build up a bit of an appetite by not eating for a few hours before the Seder. The Mishnah goes on, Va'afilu ani shebiyisrael lo yochal ad shiyasev. And even the poorest Jew should not eat until he sits down for the Seder. V'lo yifchatu lo me'arba'a kosod shel yayin. And they should not give him less than 4 cups of wine, va'afilu min hatamchui, even if it is provided from the community soup kitchen. So what is the Mishnah teaching us here? Number 1, there is a tradition of fasting for a few hours before the Seder. And number 2, everybody, including even the poorest member of the Jewish community, should be given 4 cups of wine. Drinking 4 cups of wine in the course of the Seder is not simply a privilege for the well-to-do or even the moderately well-to-do. Every Jew, including those who are dependent on the rest of the community, including needy Jews, should be given 4 cups of wine for the Seder. Our second source, the Tosefta, another Tanaitic source, adds some details. Mitzvah al adam l'sameach banav uvnei veito baregel. It is a mitzvah for one to cause his children and those in his household to rejoice on a festival. Bameh mesamchan, how do we rejoice? Biyayin, with wine. Dichtiv, as it is written in the book of Psalms, v'yayin yisamach levav enosh. Wine gladdens the heart of man. Rabbi Yoshua Omer, nashim bara'ui lahem, uktanim bara'ui lahem. Rabbi Joshua indicates that also applies to women and children as is appropriate for them. So the Tosefta is giving us a little bit of an explanation for why we drink wine at the Seder. Wine is a symbol of joy, and of course we toast the joy of every holiday, including Shabbat, with Kiddush traditionally made over wine or grape juice, because, as this line from Psalms indicates, wine is associated with joy, and so because of the joy of any major Jewish holiday, and in particular the joy of Pesach, in this context, we rejoice with this symbol of joy, namely wine. And Rabbi Yoshua adds that the privilege of drinking wine at the Seder applies to women and children. So you might ask, why is it necessary to add this point? Why is it necessary to indicate that women should also drink 4 cups of wine? The answer is that a general principle in the Mishnah is that women are exempt from positive time-bound mitzvot. And since the drinking of the wine at the Seder is done at a particular time, after sundown, and before the Seder is concluded, you might think that women would be exempt from this, and so Rabbi Yehoshua wants us to know that women as well should drink 4 cups of wine. So Rabbi Yehoshua indicates that this applies also to women. You might think that women are exempt from this. No, they too should be included in this particular act of rejoicing, drinking 4 cups of this symbol of joy. And children as well, as is appropriate for them. Children, of course, have no specific mitzvah obligations. Nevertheless, they too should drink 4 cups of wine. But notice that Rabbi Yehoshua says, "B'ra'ui lahem." Children should not drink the same amount of wine that adults are drinking. When I was a child, the wine cups that we children got at the Seder were the small wine cups. The adults, at least some of the adults, drank from larger cups. And so the Tosefta clarifies why we drink wine, because it's a symbol of joy, and also clarifies that lest you think that women are not included in this tradition, or that children are not included in this tradition, the answer is grown men and grown women and children should all drink 4 cups of wine or grape juice at the Seder in amounts that are appropriate for them. I want to return for a moment to the top of the first page of my handout, which I entitled, "Why do we drink 4 cups of wine at the Seder?" And notice that neither the Mishnah nor the Tosefta indicated why we drink 4 cups of wine. They did clarify that everyone should drink wine at the Seder, including poor people, including men and women and children, but it didn't deal with the question of why 4 cups. Why not 1 cup? Why not 5 cups? Why not 3 cups? What's so significant about the number 4, the 4 cups of wine at the Seder? Well, we turn to the Talmud, and there we find 5 different explanations for why we drink specifically 4 cups of wine at the Seder. And so the Talmud begins by asking the question, Minayin la'arba'a kosot? From where do they derive the basis of 4 cups? Again, why 4 cups of wine? Not 3, not 5, not 2. Why 4 cups of wine? The first explanation comes from Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Rabbi Benaiah. Keneged arba geulot. They correspond to the 4 redemptions, or specifically to the 4 promises of redemption that we read in Exodus chapter 6. V'hotzeiti, I will take you out. V'hitzalti, I will deliver you. V'ga'alti, I will redeem you. V'lakachti, and I will take you to be my nation. 4 promises of redemption, 4 promises of redemption that were fulfilled with the Exodus from Egypt. That's why 4 cups of wine at the Seder. But that's only the first explanation. The second explanation comes from Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, who says, Keneged arba kosot shel paro. They correspond to the 4 cups of wine mentioned in reference to Pharaoh. Now, these 4 proof texts all come from Genesis chapter 40. Remember, the Exodus story doesn't begin until we get to the book of Exodus. In the first chapter of Exodus, we read of the enslavement of the Israelites, and that long saga continues until the Exodus itself in chapter 15. But here, back in Genesis chapter 40, we're reading about 4 cups mentioned in reference to Pharaoh. V'chos paro biadi, Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. V'eschat otam el kos paro, and I pressed the grapes into Pharaoh's cup. Ve'etein et hakos al kaf paro, and I placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. V'natata kos paro biado, you will place Pharaoh's cup in his hand. What are these 4 phrases from? They all come from the story of Joseph, who is imprisoned in Egypt, interpreting the dream of the royal cupbearer, who was also imprisoned in Egypt. He correctly interprets the dreams of the cupbearer, and subsequently the story is told to Pharaoh, who learns about this young Hebrew who is adept at interpreting dreams, and ultimately this results in Joseph's own liberation from jail, and subsequently his elevation to the second highest position in all of Egypt. And so, like the first 15 chapters of Exodus, the story of the Israelites' enslavement and ultimately their liberation, this story toward the end of Genesis is also a story of, in this case, imprisonment and ultimately Joseph's liberation. 4 cups in this story of liberation, another explanation for 4 cups of wine at the Seder. Explanation number 3. Rabbi Levi Amar keneged arba malchuyot. Rabbi Levi said the 4 cups of wine at the Seder correspond to the 4 kingdoms: Babylonia, Persia, Greece, and Rome. 4 major empires who at different periods of time had control over the Jews and who tried to oppress the Jews and arguably tried to destroy the Jews. And yet in all of those 4 cases, those 4 kingdoms were all unsuccessful in their attempt to destroy the Jews. 4 kingdoms who oppressed the Israelites, 4 cups of wine because of their lack of success in destroying the Israelites. The Talmud's 4th explanation, V'Rabbanan Amrei Arba'a Kosod Shel Por'anut. The sages say that they correspond, that the 4 cups of wine correspond to the 4 cups of retribution. Shahakadosh Baruch Hu Adid Lahashkot et Umot Ha'olam, that the Holy Blessed One will give to the evil nations of the world to drink. And what follows are 4 proof texts, 2 from the prophet Jeremiah, 2 from the book of Psalms. Each of these proof texts makes the point that one day these 4 nations that have tried to oppress the Jews will drink a cup of retribution. And so we drink 4 cups of wine, of celebration, corresponding to the 4 cups of retribution that God will force Israel's enemies to drink. And finally, the Talmud's 5th explanation, Uch Negdan, and corresponding to them, Atid HaKadosh Baruch Hu Lahashkot et Yisrael Arba Kosot Shel Nechamot. The Holy Blessed One will give Israel 4 cups of consolation to drink. In addition to forcing Israel's enemies to drink cups of retribution, God will give Israel 4 cups of consolation to drink. And here we have 3 proof texts, each from the book of Psalms, which underscore that theme. Adonai manat chelki v'chosi. Adonai is my allotted share and my portion, but the Hebrew word is kosi, my cup. The second text, Dishanta v'shemen roshi, kosi rivaya. You anointed my head with oil, my cup overflows. You may recognize that from Psalm 23. And the third text, V'hadein kosi shuot esa terrain. And this phrase, I raise the cup of deliverance, indicates 2, because the word kos is singular, 1 cup, but the word yeshuot, deliverance, is plural. And so the rabbis say, that means that kos yeshuot, a cup of deliverances, indicates 2. Hence, these 3 passages from the book of Psalms indicate 4 cups of wine. So those are our 5 explanations for why we drink not 3 cups of wine at the Seder, not 5 cups of wine at the Seder, not 1 cup of wine at the Seder, but 4 cups of wine. Let's turn now to the question of charoset. What is the significance of charoset? Well, we'll start with the Mishnah again. Heviu lifanav matzah v'chazeret v'charoset. They bring before him matzah, bitter herbs, and charoset. Afal pi she'ein charoset mitzvah, even though the eating of charoset is not a mitzvah. Now, when in the Seder do we eat charoset? We eat it when we make the so-called Hillel sandwich. We take some matzah, we take some maror, some bitter herbs, and we take some charoset, and we put them together and make a sandwich and eat them together. But by that time in the Seder, we've already eaten matzah for the first time, and we've said the bracha, thank you, God, for commanding us to eat matzah. And we've also eaten maror, bitter herbs, for the first time. And then, too, we've also said a bracha. Thank you, God, for commanding us to eat maror, to eat bitter herbs. But there's no bracha for eating charoset. We just include it in that little sandwich, in the Hillel sandwich. However, Omer Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok mitzvah. Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok says, eating charoset is a mitzvah. We eat matzah, bitter herbs, and charoset during the course of the Seder, even though eating charoset is not a mitzvah, although Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok says that it is a mitzvah. Bottom line is, we eat charoset at the Seder. That's really all that the Mishnah is telling us about charoset. But now let's see what the Talmud has to teach us about charoset. In this passage from the Talmud, the Gemara begins by asking the question, my mitzvah? Why is eating charoset considered a mitzvah? Or to put it another way, why is eating charoset at the Seder important? Or to put it yet another way, what does charoset symbolize? Now we'll see two explanations, one of which is going to sound familiar to you, and one of which might not sound particularly familiar. Rabbi Levi Omer, Zecher Latapuach. Rabbi Levi says it is in remembrance of the apple tree. The Rabbi Yochanan Omer, Zecher Latit. And Rabbi Yochanan says it is in remembrance of the mortar. Well, most of us grew up hearing the second explanation, that charoset symbolizes the mortar with which the enslaved Israelites made bricks. But Rabbi Levi says charoset is also in remembrance of the apple tree. What apple tree? Well, the Talmud will get to that. But before that, let's pursue the discussion of charoset symbolizing the mortar. Amar Abaye. Abaye said, Hilkach tzarich lekahoye v'tzarich lesamuche. Therefore, one must make it acrid, and one must make it thick. Lekahoye zecher latapuach. One must make it acrid in remembrance of the apple tree. V'tzarich lesamuche zecher latit. And one must make it thick in remembrance of the mortar. Well, again, we're all familiar with the mortar symbolism of the charoset, but what apple are we talking about? Do you remember an old Andrews Sisters song, Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree with Anyone Else But Me? Well, in the biblical book Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, we have a similar phrase. The phrase is, Tachat hatapuach orarticha, under the apple tree I roused you. What is that about? Rashi, the famous commentator to the Talmud, explains that this is an allusion to a midrash, to a rabbinic legend that says that despite the Egyptians' attempts to disrupt Israelite life, not only by enslaving the Israelites, not only by imposing on them harsh labor, but the Egyptians also separated Israelite husbands from Israelite wives, certainly as an attempt to cut down on Israelite procreation. If Israelite husbands and wives can't get together, Israelite husbands and wives can't make more Israelite babies. And yet this midrash tells us that under the shade of apple trees, God made it possible for Israelite husbands and wives to get together. That's what the apple is in this Talmudic passage. It's a symbol of God watching out for the Israelites, watching out for Israelite families, and making sure that Israelite husbands and wives can do what husbands and wives do. The apple, then, is a symbol of God's special protection of the Israelites even during their enslavement. And so the Talmud gives us two symbolic explanations for the charoset. The second one, the one that we're most familiar with, you make the charoset thick, which means you put enough chopped walnuts in to make it thick, to remind us of the mortar. But you put enough apples in to make it acrid, to make it both sweet and tart, to remind us of the apple trees, the symbol of God's protection of the Israelites during their enslavement. So there are our explanations. Remember that I began by telling you that the sources we were going to consider came from two periods in our history. The Tannaitic sources, the Mishnah and the Tosefta, come from the 3rd century. What was going on in the life of the Jews in the 3rd century? We were still living under the thumb of Rome. During the 1st century, the Romans had destroyed the temple, had destroyed the capital city of Jerusalem in their ongoing oppression of the Jews. A few decades later, the Jews tried to fight back. The Bar Kokhba revolt, a military failure. The Jews were not able to throw off the powerful Roman Empire from their backs. And what did the Romans do after that? It's as if the Emperor Hadrian said to the Jews, you think you've been suffering under the thumb of Rome up to this time? You ain't seen nothing yet. And what followed was a period of suffering known as the Hadrianic persecutions, perhaps one of the most terrible periods in our history up to that time, at least since the enslavement in Egypt itself. And so when the Mishnah and the Tosefta were compiled in the 3rd century, the Jews were still reeling from Roman oppression, still living under the thumb of Rome, barely hanging on. And so you see that the Tannaitic sources, the Mishnah and the Tosefta, deal pretty much solely with the rules. In the case of wine, everybody gets 4 cups of wine. Even poor people who are dependent on the community, even women and children, all are included. And in the case of charoset, the Mishnah explained, we eat charoset along with matzah and maror, even though it's not a mitzvah, although one opinion is that it is a mitzvah. But in the case of both symbols, the 4 cups of wine and charoset, it is the Talmud, composed in the 6th century, composed in a period in which, well, let's just say the Jews were suffering less. They were oppressed less than their forebears had been some centuries earlier. And in this later time, they had perhaps the luxury to ask the questions, what do these symbols mean? And so the Talmud gave us 5 different explanations for why we drink specifically 4 cups at the Seder. And in the discussion of charoset, the Talmud there as well gave us 2 symbolic explanations for charoset. So here's my question. Which should be our model? The model of the Mishnah, dealing only with the rules, because we don't have the luxury to go beyond the rules. Just clarify the rules. Just the simple rules. Who drinks wine at the Seder, and is charoset obligatory or not? Is that our model? Just holding on, just fulfilling the rules? Or should our model be one of the Talmud that asks, what's it all about? What does this tradition symbolize? What does that tradition symbolize? What lessons can we learn from this tradition or that tradition? It seems to me, and hopefully it seems to many of you as well, that it is the Talmud's approach that should be our approach. If when we sit down at the Seder, we're concerned only about the rules, we say this bracha now, we eat this symbolic food here, we drink this cup of wine here, and so on and so on. If all we're doing is fulfilling the rules, then in a sense, all we're doing is going through the motions. The Talmudic model is trying to challenge us at our Sidarim year after year to fill our Sidarim with more and more questions and with more and more answers. Chag Kasher v'Sameach. May you all have a kosher and a happy holiday.